Our caching setup is working pretty well, but there's still a couple of issues that I want to address. We have implemented all of our caching logic directly inside of the exec function. Remember, anytime any query is issued inside of our application, the exec function will always run. And what that means is that every query is being cached. Now that might be okay for the application we're working on right now, but I can very easily imagine circumstances where we would not want to automatically cache every single query. For example, remember that Redis storage is generally pretty darn expensive. Like storing information in Redis, not the cheapest thing in the world. So if we have an application where we know that we have to be doing a lot of queries that return a lot of information, we might want to make sure that those are not cached, just to save on value of what we're having to pay to a Redis provider. That's just one circumstance, but I bet you can imagine other circumstances as well. So I think that we need to figure out some way to say like, hey, this query over here, this should be cached, but this one over here, no, don't cache this. I'm going to open up my blog routes file inside of my routes directory. And inside of here, I'm going to again find the route that retrieves our big list of blog posts. So here's my thought. I think that we should create a new function that is tied to every query. I think we should call that function cache, and we should call it like so. I think that if this function gets called, then that means that this query right here should make use of our caching system. But if that .cache is not present, so if it's not tied on to the query, then we should avoid the caching system altogether. In other words, by default, we should attempt to not cache anything unless we specifically try to have it cached. I think that would make it very clear, because then an engineer who is looking at our code in the future could very easily look at this query right here and say the query right above it, and they could easily say, oh, okay, this is going to be cached, but this one is not, because this one up here does not have the .cache tacked onto it. So I think that would be a very clear system. The only question is, how do we implement it? Well, that's the hard part. Okay, I'm going to clean up this .cache down here really quick. And then I'm going to go back to my cache.js file. So when I added on that .cache statement, I tacked it on to a query instance. And remember, all the queries, inherit, I think is the best word here. All of our queries that we create inherit from this query.prototype right here. So if we add on additional functions to this prototype object, they will be available to any query that we create inside of our application. So to add on that cache function, we would write out mongoose.query.prototype.cache equals function, like so. Now do make sure that you're using the function keyword here, just like we were before. We do not want to be using an arrow function, because if you use an arrow function, it's going to mess with the value of this. So now we need to write some logic in here that makes sure that if we call this function and then later have exec be executed, we make sure that caching will be enabled. But if cache is not called, then when cache is called, we want to skip the caching system. So to do so, we could add in some simple flag to the .cache right here. So we'll say that if anyone ever calls .cache, we will set the value of some random property that we're going to assign on the query itself to true. So I'll do something like this.useCache equals true. Now a couple thoughts here, a couple things I want to mention. First off is the value of this. Remember, this is equal to the query instance. So anytime that we write a query, like we did right here back inside of our blog routes file, this right here creates a query instance. So if we then called .cache on it, that would set the value of this.useCache to true for only this query and no other query inside of our application. Now the property name of useCache, I just made up off the top of my head, just to be clear. So we can call this useCache, or we can call it underscore cache. It's totally up to you, whatever you want to call it. Now we're setting this property on this inside of the cache function, but because the same query instance is referenced from both this cache function and exec, because remember, these are both functions that exist on a single query instance, then over inside the exec function, we could reference this property by just writing out this.useCache, like so. So now we could do a very simple if statement check at the top of exec. We could check to see if use cache is true. And if it's true, we will run all the caching logic that we just added in. But if it's false, then we will skip all this caching logic and simply run the original exec function that does not include any caching logic whatsoever. So to do that, we might add in if this dot use cache equals false. And this right here is a little bit more verbose than it needs to be. We could condense this to just be if not use cache. Then we will run the original exec function and return the result of it right away and skip all the other caching logic that we have inside this file. So I would say return exec.apply with this and arguments, like so. Now, one more quick thing. Inside the cache function, the idea here is that we could tack this thing on as like a chainable property. So in other words, it'd be really nice if we could do something like, so back inside of my route handler, inside the blog routes file, by the way, it would be really nice if we could do something like .find, .cache, .limit 10, .sort, or whatever other properties. So it'd be really nice if we could just throw this in here and chain it like any other of these chainable function calls that we're used to that are tied to queries. So to make sure that it's an actual chainable function call, we would return this from the function itself, like so. That's all we have to do, and now it's chainable. Okay, so I'm going to go back over to my blog routes file, and I'm going to say that I want to cache this query right here and nothing else inside of my application. So I'm going to make sure that this query alone and nothing else inside my app has the .cache call. All right, so I'm going to save this, and then I'm going to go refresh my application inside the browser. And hey, well, it looks like everything worked the way I expected. Now I can refresh, and I still see all my data appear again. Okay, so it definitely looks like, hey, at first glance, maybe it worked, maybe it didn't, I don't know. A very easy way to check would be to create another blog post. Because remember, at this point, we are not expiring any cache values. So if we create another blog post and it does not immediately appear on this list right here, that means that our list of blog posts must be getting cached. So let's do that right now just to test. So I'm going to grab some lorem ipsum text. I'll then make my third blog post. And then I'll save the blog. And now back over on this list right here, I do not see that line or that new blog post appear. However, if I go back over to my application and remove the .cache call, so now I'm going to take it out and then save this file, I should be able to go back over, refresh the page, and now see that third post appear because now I am not making use of caching. Okay, cool, so that looks pretty good. So we've now got this reusable helper that we can tack on to absolutely any query that we make inside of our application to decide whether or not to serve that value from cache. So that's definitely a good improvement, but we still have some issues around expiring cache records and making sure that we can see new data appear after it's been changed inside Mongo. So let's pause right here. We'll continue in the next video and figure out how to add in some better cache expiration to our application. So I'll see you in just a minute.